Welcome to EFT Nation, your home for all things tapping. For show notes and resources, please visit EFTtappingtraining.com. We are your tapping hosts. I'm Alina Frank.
And I'm Craig Wiener. The information provided in this podcast is not a substitute for counseling or medical advice. The information presented here is meant to inspire and educate listeners, but are not guarantees of any kind.
All right, today we are, it's interesting timing because when this comes out, it will be All Souls Day, Day of the Dead, and we are here to talk about the serious matter of grieving. And grief, using EFT for grief.
Yeah, that's one that I hear often, and it's one that's a little tricky.
Well, yeah, I mean the people know that it takes time, and that it is one of the most, people will call it challenging, but I want to move away from feeling like it is it just takes time.
Right.
That's all it is.
Right.
So we need to acknowledge that.
Time, healing at one's own pace, given one's own circumstances, and
exactly
so many different things. So we can't rush it. We can't have a plan. We can't have a timeline.
Right.
Whether we're working with a client or they're tapping for themselves.
Yep. So I want to start by saying that there are a lot of forms of grief. And we've seen that in the last few years. The grief of losing one's community, the grief of one's loss of normalcy, of
connection to others, and
exactly.
touch, and,
exactly.
and seeing family. I mean, it's been 2 years since you've seen your family.
Yes.
Given pandemic situation, and there's grief associated with that.
Absolutely.
That loss of connection.
So I think that those are all important to talk about. I think the focus of this podcast is going to be focusing on bereavement, which is the grief of losing a loved one.
Yeah, and that's one that I think when people think of grief, they think of the most.
Sure, and when you and if you have those other forms of grief going on, you can certainly apply some of these things to that as well.
Sure. Yep.
All right. So, things that you might want to focus on and tap on if you're going through this. The feeling that the plans that you've made will not come to fruition in the future with that person. Yeah,
actually, that makes me want to step back for a moment, because just tapping on grief in its entirety...
Right. Yeah, nowhere. You won't get anywhere.
It can be so overwhelming because there's so many different aspects...
Absolutely.
And facets to that grief that just tapping, even though I'm grieving...
Right.
It's not the best course of action here. So what you started to do there, I felt like I need to back up, is to get more specific, and let's start to look at some of the different ways, whether you're working with a client or yourself, that if you can take a small piece, feel better about that piece, work out another piece, we can start to feel like progress is being made. So as you said, one of the aspects of grief of having lost somebody is, the plans.
Yeah.
Together that aren't going to happen together.
Right.
And that can be a big source of grief.
Right. The pain that you feel remembering times in the past.
Yes, that you can't talk about with them in the same way and share with them, and past can be a painful source of grief.
Right. The potential loss or stressors involving financial issues if you lose, let's say, a partner.
I mean, like we want to put that lower, but it's an important piece, the grief that's associated and has those, those financial implications that life is going to be so much different now. And maybe, for some, maybe much harder.
Sure.
Without the partner. So you have the loss of the stability financially, the loss of the person, and they can get intertwined.
Yep. So painful reminders or triggers. So I know that for me, and some of these could be very hidden. For me, I just realized recently that 28 years ago, I had a constant trigger of having a nursery for a child that I had she was delivered stillborn. Yeah. So I had a nursery there for a long time in the house where that door was either closed or went into, stored stuff in there. That was a constant unconscious trigger that came out in my body as a result of having that there. So painful reminders or triggers are good to tap on.
Right. Seeing people with a loved one.
Yes.
Seeing someone or
Exactly.
a picture of that we keep around that may be a trigger. Other relationships or people that have something similar,
right.
but still have it.
Right,
and
exactly.
You don't.
Like a couple. Like if you see
Sure.
a couple that's still together, or you see a child, or a pregnant mom, or
friends that you used to share and always be together as two couples, maybe.
Exactly.
And now all of a sudden you see them, and now it's the three of you. And while there's a source of connection and joy, there's also grieving with that.
So anticipate the need really to tap when anniversaries show up.
Anniversary grief is huge.
Right. So the anniversary of the death, or a birthday, or a holiday.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
Tap on your feelings of being uncomfortable sharing what you feel with others.
Say more.
Well, I feel so burdened. I'm such a burden. I'm like a broken record. All I do is talk about how much pain I'm in. Mm-hmm. So that could be.
Okay. What about if there are emotions that are connected to grief but are also like don't make sense, or you're not comfortable talking about it, like anger?
Yeah.
Because they didn't maybe take good care of themselves or their health, or
exactly.
or they did something that led to their death that creates feelings other than grief. That here you are supposed to be just feeling grief, but wow, there's other ones there.
Sure. Mm-hmm. You can tap on what well-intentioned people tell you that makes you angry or sad.
I hear that one a lot.
Oh gosh, yes.
I see that one. I observe that one a lot. The specific
even from
examples.
Doctors, even from therapists, even from holistic practitioners.
All well-meaning friends.
Right, exactly.
That will come off with a comment that's either too lighthearted or too heavy or too intrusive or
spiritual bypassing.
They. And I want to not judge that. Many people don't know and are very uncomfortable and trigger themselves around death and get awkward and anxious around that. And so tapping on, how you feel about that specific example of when somebody posted that on social media or said that to you or left you that message or whatever.
Okay, tap on blocks that you have to participating in any kind of religious or spiritual ritual or ceremony that mark the passing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, for some people, that's a source of great comfort.
Yes.
For others, it's a reminder, and they'd rather just bypass that.
Right. You can tap on your inability to do, like, real self-care. You need self-care more than anything when you're grieving, and it's when you're least likely to do it.
Yeah, because putting the attention on yourself when there are others, and when you should be thinking about the other, and all those things that we tell ourselves.
Or when you're in a bed and you don't want to get out.
Exactly, yeah.
So tap on the need, if you see this in yourself, to numb with food, alcohol, or drugs.
Yeah. To not feel the pain.
Yeah.
And not feel the grief. Because somebody going through grief and the stages of grief, there'll be times that they feel they need to fully immerse themselves in it. And other times will do anything and everything to just get a break from it.
Sure.
And step away from it.
So losing a parent when you're young often leads to a mostly unconscious feeling of blaming yourself. Just like kids blame themselves for their parents' divorce, they often blame themselves for their parents' death in some
unconscious way.
Unconscious, completely illogical way, but it's there. So same with losing a child. You blame yourself. How could you not? I mean, after all, a parent is responsible for the health and safety and well-being of their child. So that's a big one.
Yeah.
So the other thing is that we really know, like with EFT, that if we try to ignore something, we might kid ourselves and say, okay, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm just going to shut that door. I'm just going to move on with my life. I am going to just know that that's part of life is that this person passed away, and I'm just going to just bulldoze and hide my feelings and not allow myself to grieve. And we know that can be a source of some serious challenges down the road.
And that might be the strategy that's most available for you to get through that period. And there's not a judgment about that. Because
no, but if you catch yourself doing that early enough,
right,
you can tap on it.
You can. If there's an openness and a willingness to then work on, heal that, approach that, right? But everybody's at that point at their own timing.
Yes. So it won't go any faster if you ignore it, for sure. And there's a saying that the only cure for grief is to grieve.
Right. In whatever way makes sense for you.
You're right. And then, I want to talk about when you might need to see professional help. Mm-hmm. Either in a support group, in a bereavement group, in parents who have lost children's groups, or losing a partner group. And a therapist, a licensed mental health care professional, will be able to identify whether your grief has turned into something more serious, like depression.
Right.
There is also the diagnosis of complicated grief or persistent complex bereavement disorder.
Sure. And there's a difference between feeling depressed and a diagnosis of depression.
Exactly.
Right? And so, sadness, grief, feeling depressed, feeling exhausted, feeling fatigued, feeling, all wanting to not participate. Those are kind of like post-traumatic stress. This is like post-loss grief. I mean, there's a natural process we go through.
Of course.
But then
situational depression.
Sure, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to mention about all this are the stages of grief, which have become really well known. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross.
Work, yeah.
Yeah, so she wrote that there are different stages of grief, and those are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But we now know that you can move through some of those really quickly or not go through them at all, bounce back and forth between the stage, be stuck in a stage for a long time, then skip to the acceptance piece. In other words, it's not a predictable path. And we so are creatures of wanting everything to be able, we need a plan.
Categorize, yep.
Controlled, here we go. I'm in the next step.
Right.
I'm in the next stage. I'm moving forward.
Doesn't always work.
And it doesn't work out that way with grief, especially.
Yep.
The other thing I wanted to mention, which is so important, the secondary gain. So if you don't know what secondary gain is, go back to the wonderful podcast that we did on psychological reversal / secondary gain. There is a psychological reversal / secondary gain on if I let this pain go, I will forget my loved one.
That is...
It's huge.
There so often.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, when people think of EFT, the misnomer is that we're tapping away the emotion.
Right.
Right? Excuse me, but I fully disagree with that. It actually allows us to feel and accept the emotion, and in that witnessing and feeling and accepting it, it often morphs and then changes into something else. It goes through its cycle. So the idea that if I tap on my grief, the grief will go away, and my grief is my connection
Yes, right.
to the person I lost,
That's
and I
what
don't
I
want to
want.
lose that
Exactly.
connection. Why would I want to tap on or lose this grief?
Exactly.
Right? And so that's a big, big, big consideration for how and when to work on that piece.
Absolutely.
Right? In other words, you can still, right, even though it makes sense, but it doesn't when you're there, is you can still have the connection to the lost one, even though you're not grieving. Right? On the other side of grieving,
Right.
still can even be a deeper connection. Grieving isn't the only way to be connected, but it's the one that comes up first and is strongest. And the fear is that if we let go of it, that we'll lose that connection.
Right. Where the truth is that the love will always be there. In fact, clearer for many people once that real deep pain of the grief is has subsided.
Yeah. So, is it possible to tap on situations around the grieving process, no matter how long afterwards or how long ago
Yeah.
the loss was?
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
If you find you're making progress toward what you're trying to get to, great. If you're finding that it's too big, too highly emotional, too dysregulating, and you're noticing that you're not tapping because it feels too big, then please consider the importance of a co-regulation, the importance of working with somebody that's skilled at working with grief and EFT and tapping, and so finding somebody that really is excellent at that.
I'm trying to think of the word or the term that is about like that grief, like losing someone close to you, might open up the door to really serious trauma that you had in your childhood. Like I've seen that experience with some people who were my clients. So let's just say their husband died, and that triggered all of the pain and all of the almost the grief of the childhood that they hadn't even known, like repressed memories from childhood about sexual abuse and things like that.
Well, in other words, that grief is
the catalyst.
It's a catalyst to the chasm
right.
of deeply felt pain.
Right.
And that it may go down that rabbit hole towards something even bigger than the grief. And then I'll feel like the quicksand I will never get out of. And I'll be like sucked into that abyss.
Exactly.
Kind of feeling.
Exactly. And that's when they can experience things like PTSD. All right. So just wanted you to get a good, clear insights into how to work with grief, the signs for when you really might need to work with a practitioner or even a licensed mental health care professional who's trained in grief, and hopefully EFT as well.
All right. And if you're dealing with this, our hearts go out to you.
Absolutely.
There is healing that's possible.
Yes.
Right? There is time, right? And time is an important element. And your own unique healing journey that has lessons and has healing for you. We wish that and send that to you.
Thanks for joining us today at EFT Nation. And remember that you can find show notes and previous episodes at EFTtappingtraining.com.